re-welcome back onto the stage Shirin, Principal Advisor for Communications at the EIB, and she's going to moderate this conversation with four fabulous guests. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, Director General for the World Trade Organization; Cardinal Peter Turkson, Chancellor, Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences; Ethiopia Stafara, Regional Vice President for Africa at the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group; and Sania Nishtar, CEO at the GAVI Alliance.
Thank you very much, Lisa. And thank you very much, President Calvino, and also, if he's watching our live stream, to the Secretary General Guterres as well, for getting us on the right track for this discussion. President Calvino talked about a different path. And in many ways, this is what the panel is about, building a new global order. And we have here with me four really exceptional people, leaders, but also providing with four really specific perspectives on what that means in practice. President talked about allies. You are allies. And because of that, we don't need to necessarily ask whether we need the multilateral order, but what does that actually mean from your points of view? How can Europe contribute to making that a reality? How do we handle the fact that trust in the global order, globalization, international institutions is not as high as we might like it to be in many of our own institutions? How do we tackle that? And specifically, I want to ask you each how we can make sure that the important agendas of health and climate stay firmly on the radar of leaders and policymakers, and how best to make sure that we don't just defend them, but actually move it forward. So maybe I can start by asking each of you to, in this context where there's a lot of doom and gloom, where can you point to a really successful example of multilateralism in practice that we can build on now? Maybe I can start with you, Vice President, from your point of view at the International Finance Corporation.
So thank you, and thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to see President Calvino. We worked together many years ago on solving problems that were collective, that required collective action, and I can see we're still dedicated to the same objective. I'm a dyed-in-the-wool, as they say in the United States, internationalist, because
you must be feeling lonely these days, then.
As an internationalist, yes.
Welcome.
Because I believe that collective action problems, which is what we face, can only be solved by multilateralism, right? And, you know, there are tons of examples, but I can point to one that's very recent. We've been working with, within the World Bank Group on an initiative called AIM 2030, which is in essence an objective whereby we want to increase the production of pharmaceutical products on the continent. We want to double it by 2030. We have a number of governments who don't want to be held hostage to global supply chains when it comes to pharmaceutical production. Now, as it turns out, there are only about 7 or 8 countries on the continent that are ready today to actually produce pharmaceuticals at the level and at the quality that's required. And so it's requiring that we figure out what are these 7 or 8 countries, but then get the other countries to understand that you're going to have to accept the production from them and think about having common standards, phytosanitary standards, some mutual recognition of each other's standards, because otherwise they'll produce and you won't consume, and we've defeated the purpose. We've quite quickly gotten to agreements around the table that, yes, this is important. We've played the role of convening as a multilateral, and there are tons of these sorts of problems that only can be solved by virtue of coming together as a system.
Absolutely. Dr. Ngozi, we hope that after we sign the agreement with the European Investment Bank on trade facilitation, that you're going to say that's the transformative example. But speaking about things that exist or have existed, where would you point to a really successful example of multilateralism in action?
Well, thank you, Shirin. Thanks, Nadia, and good afternoon, everyone. It's good to join you here, and I'm looking forward to signing the agreement. I think first I want to disagree with you a little bit, Shirin. I don't think we should we should say, let's assume multilateralism is good and not talk about it. I actually think we should talk about it and question whether it's good and whether it still works. And the reason is simple. If we don't question it, if we take it for granted, we'll not appreciate what multilateralism has done and given to the world. So I think we ought to speak about it, debate it, and ask the question.
So tell us.
Yes, so multilateralism, because people tend to forget, and I can speak from the trade side. People take for granted things that have worked. On the trade side, we know that the multilateral trading system has resulted in lifting 1.5 billion people out of poverty in the past few decades. That it has worked not only for poorer countries, but for rich ones. That trade has been disinflationary in the most part because it allows goods to move where people have comparative advantage in producing some types of goods to where they don't, making things cheaper. And all the benefits of job creation, of disinflationary impact, of the benefits for people are sometimes forgotten in the criticism. But that doesn't mean that the multilateralism we have today is the right one.
Yes.
I think we need to admit that multilateralism needs to be reformed, and that all of us in each of our organizations need to be looking at whether we are fit for purpose. And I think at the World Trade Organization, we need to be more fit for purpose.
Yes, absolutely.
And we need reforms. But I want you ask for an example of multilateralism that works. And I'm going to surprise you with the answer.
You always do.
Trade is in the epicenter of the storm, where in the epicenter of the undermining of global trade rules in a way that has not happened for the past 80 years. So everybody thinks it's finished. The multilateral trading system and the rules-based system is finished. But the reason I want to surprise you is that this system must have been so logically built, because today, based on our analysis, and we haven't changed our methodology, 72% of world trade is still taking place on WTO terms, despite the undermining. So you have to ask yourself, there must be something right, something working. If after all this disruption, we still have almost 3/4 of world goods trade still taking place on those terms. So if you look for more, what does that say? So I see it as a multilateralism, a base that works. Yes. And I think what we need to do is ask ourselves, what works? And how do we build on that? And what doesn't work that we need to reform and transform for a new world where things are changing so rapidly and so fast?
Absolutely. We'll come back in a minute, and I'd like to hear from you what those reforms entail when it comes to the WTO. But let me turn to Your Eminence, Cardinal. I mean, I was thinking earlier that in many ways the Church is quite a good example of a multilateral organization. And I wonder whether you see it like that too. But also, maybe you have another example rather than just the Church. And I know you work with this foundation called Earth, Our Common Home. How do you think that we need to move away from the rather conventional understanding that we have of multilateralism and think about it in different terms, perhaps?
So thanks again. Thanks, President, for the invitation, and thanks to all of you for lending us your ears for whatever we're about to share with you. Now, certainly, following up on Ngozi's observation, multilateralism needs to be appreciated for what it is in the first place. And I think it was the basic underlying factor even for the creation of the United Nations. And I think it was so successful at the beginning because multilateralism is rooted in and thrives on something which is basically true about the human person. The human being is both a person, subject of dignity and freedom, but he's also a relational being, meant to develop himself only in relationship. These two are basic factors of the human person, and they infiltrate and develop into all the different structures with which we exercise our lives together in society. So different nations reflect this, and so different nations then can come together recognizing that it's only in relationship that they can achieve and attain their goals, as has just been made present. And so examples, yes. Unfortunately, though, the UN was formed after a war. Subsequently, the COVID, which is an example that I'm going to give about multilateralism working, was also in a crisis and pandemic. So it appears as if, though, that we take crisis and we have serious situations like this to remind us of the need to come together to be able to achieve anything. And that probably is the unfortunate side of it. So there is this value which is there, but I think we do not need a crisis moment to awaken this within us to make us achieve it. So in the event of the crisis, for example, all of a sudden, there was funding to develop local vaccines. There was the production facility. There was the market. There was the distribution channels and everything. And there was money also to be made by those who decided to invest despite the pandemic character of the situation, and they made money. So if you put all of this together, then this is something that should work under normal circumstances.
Yes,
Unfortunately, it does not.
Not just at our most vulnerable points. And actually, Sania Nishtar, as CEO of GAVI, the Vaccine Alliance, you were very instrumental and continue to be, actually. So the positive side of that is that there are partnerships that have grown from that crisis, which are now going forward beyond pandemic prevention into other areas. Is that where you do see the most successful example of multilateralism in action in recent memory?
Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Nadia, for this invitation, and thank you for that very important question. So let me build further upon what His Eminence said. Of course, you look at multilateralism from your own vantage point, and from where we sit, the collective action that comes into play during pandemics and emergencies is one of the cardinal examples of what collective action means, what collaboration means at the international stage. You can define it as multilateralism in UN parlance, but it is about collective action for public good. And health emergencies and pandemics is a classic example of that. Let me take you back to 2016 when the Ebola outbreak struck, and Ngozi would remember that time very well. She was the board chair of GAVI. And the disease was exported all over the world within a matter of weeks. And then collective action came into play. There were institutions that channeled money to promote the upstream development of the vaccines. There were other institutions that made sure economies of scale came into play to bulk procure and to drive price down. There were member states in UN language that made sure that that vaccine could be deployed wherever required, even on a preventive basis. There were manufacturers that had the incentive to produce. So last year when the Ebola outbreak happened, nobody heard about it. It didn't spill into the news. Collective action had made sure that the benefit that we wanted to achieve out of collective action was ensured. Similarly, 2024, August, the Mpox outbreak happens. And when I had come into the organization about a year prior to that, we had done simulation exercises to project what a pandemic would look like, how GAVI as an institution would invoke its mandate during different scenarios of emergencies. If the pathogen was known, the vaccine was in the market, wasn't in the market, if it was pre-qualified, not pre-qualified by WHO, pre-qualified by a country, if there was a stockpile, if there was not a stockpile, or if there was an outbreak and the pathogen was not known. And because those simulation exercises were there, we quickly coordinated with all actors. We mobilized money to DRC and to other African countries. Within 3 days of the pre-qualification of the vaccine, the order was placed to the manufacturer. We collaborated with all the other institutions. The World Health Organization played its part, and we were able to, as an ecosystem, as a collective ecosystem, we were able to address that problem. And let me acknowledge the support of the EU there, of the European countries there. They mobilized their stockpiles, they donated vaccines. And there was a huge ecosystem that came into play. There was collective action that was brought into play to contain a problem. And that is what multilateralism is. And there are successful examples of how it comes into play also.
Absolutely, and actually we'll be signing soon with the International Finance Corporation, we meaning the European Investment Bank, one of the first end-to-end vaccination hubs for Africa. So as you say, many things to flow from that. Dr. Ngozi, can we stay with this idea of trust and maybe link it to impact? Because in a way, as we said at the beginning, that there is a lack of trust in international organizations, and you acknowledge that. So how do we address that? How do you address that at the World Trade Organization? And I guess it is partly about just delivering results so people see them. People, countries, partners. Tell us a bit about the reform agenda, which you've spoken about a lot recently.
Well, trust is an intangible. But it is such an important ingredient to make things work. And if you're in a multilateral setting where there's no trust, you can't really have good results. And I can say about the World Trade Organization that we have a trust deficit, and that's part of our problem. You can remember when this was built post-World War with about 23 members around the table. These were economies that were alike, a set of countries that knew each other and trusted each other, and they built rules to govern trade, world trade, and it was successful, and there were subsequent rounds of negotiations, and more members joined. By the time the modern WTO was created in 1995, there were 76 members. Today, there are 166, and we have 22 on a waiting list. But the thing is that as the membership grew and different types of economies were admitted, and many more developing countries joined, I think the fundamental agreements and principles were never revived and changed. And those 23 who got together and trusted each other, things did not change. So as you evolve and you do not evolve the fundamental basis on which you create an organization, then some begin to feel not included. They feel the place doesn't work as well for them. And it could be rich countries like the United States today takes unilateral actions because it believes that maybe some of the rules don't work for it anymore. And that and developing countries certainly feel, many of them, the poor countries, that they are not as well integrated into the world trading system as they should be. So then the lack of trust begins to manifest itself. And if you really want to be a multilateral system that continues to work and be relevant, then you have to keep evolving, changing the rules, making yourself fit for purpose, particularly in this very fast-changing world with technology. So I think that what is amazing to me is that in spite of all these gaps and so on, there has been such a foundation that still allows the world to trade, mostly still on the rules that were built. So how do we then create this trust? I think it can only be rebuilt, not by talking about it, but by admitting to ourselves what doesn't work, and then trying to set those things right so we can build on what does work. And I think that's what I'm proud of my members at the WTO, because they're coming together to say, okay, we are now accepting that we have a whole set of issues, that some of the criticisms being leveled are valid. We need to reform. We need to look at the way we make decisions. Yeah. We are built on consensus, and we're very proud of it. And when I say consensus, at the WTO, it really gives a voice to even the smallest member. This is highly unusual. that the smallest member in the organization, the poorest one, has the same voice as the richest. This is not really what is seen in many multilateral organizations, where consensus is there, but they are also shareholding in the Multilateral Development Bank. So at the WTO, we have that. But how do we practice it? So we're very proud of it. But sometimes we practice it as unanimity in decision-making, and that holds us back. Because when we have something that works for a whole group of members, we need every member to say yes. So we need to reform that. And just another one, we call it level playing field issues. Over time, some of our rules that are built for competition and fairness, we've not really had the transparency and the practice of that fairness in the way we want. So maybe subsidies are being used in a way that some members will undermine competition in their economies with others. So we need to reform that. Just to give you 2 examples of what doesn't work. What are we doing now? So right now we've been very busy in the past 9 months trying to look at those reforms, put them together so that ministers in about 3 or 4 weeks, I hope, will come together to launch this program of deep reforms within the organization with timelines to deliver solutions in the next few months to a couple of years, because some of them need work. We need to change the rules. We need to look at the way we do business. And I believe if we succeed in doing that, we are going to get an organization that is faster, more nimble, that is able to take advantage of the very interesting opportunities in trade now. Services trade is growing digitally, digital trade, green trade. These are exciting opportunities that people don't talk about, but
Absolutely.
I'm very excited
Absolutely.
about. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. And I think there are so many lessons there for, I think if the EU Commissioner for Economy and Productivity, who we spoke to yesterday, were on the stage as well, he would hear a lot of this apply to the EU as well. I find your honesty and willingness to slay the sacred cows, if I could put it that way, at least to grapple with them, very, very refreshing. And I wonder, maybe I can ask you, Vice President, do you think that same willingness exists within the multilateral development bank community to really adapt where needed, obviously keep what's working, work together as a system more effectively? You meet with the EIB and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, among others who are here as well. What progress is being made there? Do you think, where do you think we need to move? And do you think, honestly, there is that willingness to look as much as apparently is happening at the WTO?
So within the World Bank Group, we have a history of following in the wake of Dr. Ngozi. So I'm going to do the same here, and I'm going to say one thing that's maybe unwelcome or controversial, and then something else that I think ends up being a way of looking how we work together as a system. The first thing I'll say is we need to stop competing with one another and collaborate. I'll tell a quick story. When prior to being at IFC, I was at MIGA, and when I arrived at MIGA, one of the first tasks I was given was to, based on a report that was done by the G20, to make sure that MIGA was seen as the political risk insurer of choice within the international multilateral system. And I figured, how hard can this be? I'd previously worked as a regulator, coordinating regulation around the world, different regulatory systems, different legal systems, different philosophies, different cultural contexts. And I figured this can't be in fact, it should be easier than what I previously did. I was shocked at the degree to which, when talking to the multilaterals, most of them were prepared to create their own political risk insurer rather than collaborate with us, okay? And I think that is a disservice to the system. Now, having said that, I think we're making progress, and I think one of the things that we need to do, one of the ways in which we need to change, to pick up on Dr. Ngozi's point about needing to be willing to reconsider how you do things in order to remain relevant. I think that the fact that we're moving towards impact targets rather than volume targets is a big deal. Why does M300 work, this initiative to electrify 300 million people throughout Africa, out of the 600 million that don't have electricity by 2030? It works because it is about an outcome rather than volumes of money that are put into something. It also works because it's a bit of a stretch. And that stretch actually makes us look at each other and say, we're not going to get there unless we come together.
Targets,
a stretch target,
yes,
right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
If we don't collaborate, we're not going to get there. And what's wonderful about this is it serves as an organizing principle, right? And now we're starting to do that with agriculture. We've just launched an initiative called AgriConnect, where we're looking to achieve food security for 200 million additional people around the world. We're doing the same thing in the pharmaceutical space. So I think this idea of identifying impact targets, making sure that they're a stretch, and then using that as a means to bring the community together is one of the ways in which I think we'll continue to be relevant and be better as a system.
Because I think, you know, I'm sure colleagues of mine in the audience won't mind if I say that, you know, there is a syndrome, isn't there, in institutions where somebody comes up with an ambitious target and everyone starts freaking out in case we can't meet it. And you're saying, actually, that's a good thing.
That's what brings us together. If you set it so I can get there by myself, then I have no reason to collaborate with anybody else. If I set it so that it's actually difficult, that means I try to find partners to help me get to that objective.
Yeah, yeah. Let me turn to the non-institutional representatives. Cardinal, you run this foundation. I mentioned it earlier, Earth, Our Common Home. I wonder if you can tell us a bit about that and how it feeds into this idea of maintaining trust in international missions, actually, as well as institutions, because it feels to me like we have left people behind a little bit. And this is where, you know, maybe there's an opportunity to regain trust through more involvement of communities, which is where you're also very much involved.
No, so the building trust sometimes requires innovation. And innovation occurs when one with courage embraces new opportunities or what he perceives as to be new opportunities. So essentially, so I'm here, I work out of the Vatican, but essentially, so I'm a bishop of the Catholic Church. I used to run a diocese in Ghana, in West Africa, before I was invited to the Vatican to take care of the Office for Justice and Peace. All social issues were involved. And so one of the things we thought we needed to grapple with was the dependence on missionary or young churches on Europe and America for finance and whatever. So traditionally, all of these churches have been used to providing basic services, schools, healthcare, agricultural projects, all of which require financing, so capital. Traditionally, the capital was acquired by having bishops go and preach and get some small collection and bring. And I thought that was time to change that. So I thought it was time to initiate a paradigm shift. And so with that, we introduced the concept of impact investing. So you get people to contribute to provide capital, but the capital where it doesn't go out as a donation does not come back. But it's capital that comes back to make it circular. So that you have an institution develop its facilities, it pays back, so you can help. And so the circularity of capital was a big thing we aimed at. Now from that, then we built this into a small foundation we called Earth, Our Common Home Fund. And Earth, Our Common Home Fund was meant to use two facilities. It was not to compete with government about development, but was also to remind ourselves that, like, all the collaboration events that you refer to, when the EIB, for example, has deal with a country or whatever, it's all with the government. Civil society groups outside this hardly come close to whatever the fund or the grant is about. So we thought that we developed something that would use something which churches have: permanence of leadership. A democratic system is good, but every 4 years the leadership changes. And with that change of leadership, you're likely to have everything thrown up again into turmoil. So we thought that we'd invest with a more permanent system of leadership in the community, a group of people who enjoy community trust, which is more the faithful in the churches and all of that. And so with that, use the resources available to advance the development and growth of the community. That's what Eco Impact Fund is all about.
That's very interesting.
Presently, as we sit here, we engage in providing renewable energy. We decided to start with Nigeria, not because we're going to sit here, but because we thought that Nigeria was a big country. If we're able to make it there, we'll be able to make it anywhere else in Africa. So we're doing, we've done a survey, about 18,000 communities with about 89 million people. We're working with providing kind of 8 kilowatts power for a community, and with that hope to supply all of this now. The 8 figure I talked about was what these communities have been generating with diesel fuel. Now imagine if we're able to get the communities from diesel fuel to having 8 kilowatt of renewable energy, it reduces the risk of climate change. It changes their life all over.
Yes, yes.
So that's what the Eco Impact Fund is all about.
And I think, as you say, innovation being the key word too. Innovation isn't just about what you do in the laboratory. It's actually about how you work and doing things differently, using the church and this foundation as an implementing partner, which is fascinating, I think, and private sector as well, of course. But let me turn to Sania as well. Sania, you're also undergoing a certain amount, or just about to, undergoing a certain reform within GAVI, despite the great successes. Tell us a bit about that and why you think that's important. It's called GAVI Leap, right?
Yes, and let me link the GAVI Leap to your questions about trust.
Yes.
This is a reform we have actually completed last year, and we are now in the stage of implementation. The design is complete. Basically, trust is something that you inspire when you do some very simple things. And these simple things are values that you are taught when you're a child. You're taught to be truthful, you're taught to keep your promises. And today in institutional functioning, I'm of the opinion that if you're truthful and if you keep your promises to your stakeholders, you inspire trust. It's as simple as that. I experienced it firsthand because 2 years ago when I had come, I went to Africa because 80% of our work is in Africa. And I asked leaders, from leaders to community health workers and to the women who had brought their children, and I said, how do you view GAVI? What do you want from us? And the first thing I heard was that GAVI is a very important organization for us because it ensures access to vaccines, which is the best investment in the health of our children. But your processes are very onerous, number one.
Onerous.
Your processes are onerous. They're very administration heavy. Secondly, that you take a lot of time to turn around things. Thirdly, that we want more agency over the control of resources. We don't want to be told how to spend money. We want to have control over how money ought to be spent. So these were the... And number 4, we want vaccine sovereignty. This was a consistent call we heard, particularly from the leaders. We don't want to be dependent on the outside world when it comes to access to vaccines. So the reform that we designed and which we've rolled out very quickly, was not designed by high-end consultants, did not cost millions of dollars. It was basically predicated and built on the feedback that we heard from the ground. It was designed based on the needs of the people that we are meant to serve. So we took a year and digitized our mission-critical processes. It used to take us 16 months to turn around an application, and the new target for 2026 is 1/3 of that time. Secondly, we had 8 grant applications, hundreds of contracts for countries, grant cycles that didn't align with our strategy cycles. we went to a single application, and we went to a few contracts. That's been greatly appreciated. Their third ask was, we want agency over where money should be, on which partners should work with us, on which vaccines we want to deploy, and to a very large extent, we have ceded that authority because that is how things should be. They wanted us to invest in vaccine manufacturing, and we bent backwards to create a number of different instruments. And the reason why I had a meeting with Nadia a little while ago was to see how the EIB could help us bolster that relationship. And I would like to say, with humility, with a lot of humility, that has inspired trust.
Yes.
That we listened to them, we structured something that was based on their need, and we went back to them again and again saying, we are here, these institutions are here to serve you. We come to you with respect and humility. What we've designed and structured is based on your requirements. So I think a lot of times we don't have to go into detailed theory and conceptualization. It's about trust, it's about keeping your promises, and it's about being very truthful, and it's about respecting the communities that, and I'm talking about the development sector vantage point, it's about respecting the people that you're meant to serve.
And I guess, I mean, as you said, you spoke to the president, but certainly something that's going to be signed coming soon, as we mentioned already with the IFC, is this important vaccine sovereignty project with BioVac in South Africa, which I guess organizations like yourselves have been pushing and lobbying and speaking to the MDBs to make sure that that message comes across. We've been talking a lot about health and climate, and I want to ask you, maybe Vice President first, and then to Dr. Ngozi. You're Vice President for Africa, so you see very clearly the importance of those two issues. You also have a leadership and a stakeholding where there is increased pressure, perhaps lack of support as well, for climate action, skepticism around the value of global health. I want to ask all of you, how do you make the case for these priorities to stay firmly on the international agenda? And if I can ask you a sort of supplementary question, how does Europe need to help in this regard? I mean, we have an audience here of policymakers, financiers, mainly from the European constituency. What does Europe need to do to put its money where its mouth is, but not just its money, its political will? Starting with you, Vice President.
Okay, I'll answer in two parts. First, health, and then climate. With respect to health, I mentioned this earlier. I mean, it turned, when I took the job, we undertook a bit of analysis, and we came to the realization that depending on the medical product, the pharmaceutical product, or the vaccine, 85 to 99% of what's consumed on the African continent is imported, right? And in speaking to our constituencies, or the governments that are the shareholders, it was clear that at least the African ones thought, let's see if we can do something about this. So we've launched this initiative to try and double production by 2030 and achieve the AU's objective of 60% of what's being consumed on the continent, being produced on the continent by, I think, 2040. That's going to require collective effort. That is us working with our sister organizations within the World Bank Group, but it's also partnering with the AFDB, it's working with GAVI, it's working with pharmaceutical companies. And we're quite hopeful that we'll be able to actually address what amounts to a bit of a concern about medical sovereignty.
So the momentum is there, you think?
The momentum is there. On climate, I think it's important to keep in mind that every project, every single project that we finance, we have a quadruple bottom line. It has to be profitable at some level or another, otherwise it's not productive private enterprise, and that's our mandate. It has to be environmentally and socially sustainable. It has to have impact, development impact, and it has to be adapted to climate. We don't proceed with a project unless those four bottom lines are met. And our clients are actually positively inclined, and I have the benefit of working in the private sector because they realize not addressing the resilience of the project from a climate standpoint has a financial implication at the end of the day, right? So getting them to address that doesn't prove all that challenging because they realize if I don't address it, I'm actually going to be harming my investment. We had an investment in Bangladesh. This is when I was at MIGA. It was a power plant built in a floodplain. We told them, listen, we're not going to finance it unless you do something about the fact that you're sitting in a floodplain. And they realized we need to do something about this, otherwise this billion-dollar investment is actually going to find itself underwater. Excuse the pun. In no time whatsoever. So for us, that's just part of our bread and butter. What do we need to do as a collective? I think, again, we have great partners in Europe, whether it's EIB, EBRD, and when we work on these projects together, we are like-minded, right? We understand the importance of this being addressed as a common good, but also as financial sense.
Yes, yes. Dr. Ngozi, do you see a danger, particularly in this global context of conflict, escalation, that these agendas get slightly pushed off the radar?
Well, thank you. And these are two very important agendas, and perhaps it's important to make 3 points, including addressing the role that Europe could play. I think we have to see both health and climate. These are the collective action problems that all of us, so my esteemed panelists spoke about at the beginning. No one country can solve issues of climate or issues of a pandemic, global health issues alone. So they are global public bads, if you will, or global public goods, depending on the way you look at them, that require collective action. So they are global security issues. And so it is very important that they not be pushed aside, to answer your question. And for me, I see the role of trade also in all these. Very quickly in health, it's very interesting listening because the building of these manufacturing facilities for vaccines in developing countries and in Africa came out during the heated debate during the pandemic. Yes. The WTO is home to the trade-related intellectual properties agreement, and the argument came repeatedly that, there's a blockage on the way of developing countries being able to manufacture their own vaccines, and they not import in Africa 80% of, or actually more, close to 90% of what they need, and 90% of medicines and pharmaceuticals. This agreement at the WTO helps safeguard intellectual property, and what I'm proudest of is that there was a heated debate during the pandemic saying this agreement was in the way, but WTO members were able to allow flexibilities that would enable developing countries, and the agreement is still there. If they want to manufacture and to build on the innovations for vaccines that have been made, they can do so. It took a while for us to get there, but we did. So we are actually very involved in the area of health, and we're very part of the alliance looking at how to build these manufacturing capacities. I think the second thing is on climate. I strongly believe that climate change is an existential threat and cannot be put aside. So for us at the WTO, with respect to trade, what we see is that you cannot really solve the problem. Trade is part of the solution. There is no way you can take innovations from where they are made for green technology to where they are needed, where people may not have the capacity without trade. It's trade that enables this flow of ideas and of technologies to flourish. And we are strongly part of it, so we also see ourselves as very supportive of this particular area. And third is, your question about what can Europe, or how can Europe, we today will be signing this agreement to support an investment facilitation agreement at the WTO. Developing countries recognize that aid is fast becoming a thing of the past. Many of them are in debt distress on the African continent, for instance. Debt service to revenue ratios for some are quite high, greater than 20%, so they have to look for investment. How do they make themselves investment friendly? They have to sweep away those things that lie in the way of attracting investment as much as they possibly can, the bureaucracy, the licensing, the governance or corruption issues that lie in the way. This agreement will enable them to help do that. You know, the Doing Business report of the World Bank that used to try to attack some of these issues. Well, 128 WTO members are signing on to this. And what I'm proud of is that with the EIB has agreed to work with us to help attract European investment into some of these countries that are signatories or participants in this agreement. That's what we're going to sign. And we begin with a set of phase 1 in Africa to try and see if those members, we can work on them to assess their needs, we can develop projects jointly. You will help us leverage not just EIB financing, but additional private sector financing. We're looking to a 3-to-1 leverage ratio. Maybe we'll be able to get about €1 billion by 2013 to 6 countries, and then we move on, and we can attract IFC and others. So this is a very interesting thing to invest in: green energy, clean energy, in critical minerals processing, in biotech, in digital. It's very exciting. So I'm looking forward to it. And Europe can lead. Europe is a strong supporter of multilateralism, of rules-based trade, and European businesses, I think Africans are also looking, as well as other developing countries, to you to play a role.
Thank you. A true definition, hopefully, of a win-win partnership. And just briefly, Sania, can you come in on this in terms of the partnership with Europe and how that should look in the future? I think Dr. Ngozi's given a very interesting kind of paradigm in a way that we could look at in terms of building the new global order that brings in this idea of trade as being a sort of pivotal element, but a different kind of trade.
So I think at this point in time, Europe has a huge responsibility. And I'll use the global health architecture as a vantage point to make a case. Because currently, global health is undergoing an existential crisis. 40% of ODA, official development assistance, has gone out of the window. The health of some of the most vulnerable communities in the world is at threat. Each one of us as agencies, many of us here in this room, have downsized by more than 30%, and we don't know what's around the corner. And discussions on reform of the international development and global health architecture is one of the most contemporary subjects of intellectual discourse and debate today. Everybody is writing about different models and how agencies should merge, sunset, come together, and how a new global development order is such a pressing imperative. I don't disagree with any of that. But the question is that we need leadership at this moment. Somebody needs to sit all the stakeholders down and say, well, what is the objective of this exercise? What agencies are in scope? What is the process going to look like? And what are the various strands of the process going to look like? And what type of outcome are we going to achieve? Because the path that you take, the agencies that are in scope, are entirely dependent on the objective. If the objective is to address the fragmentation and duplication at a country level, there's a very different formula and mechanism and pathway that has to come into play. If the objective is to reduce the burden on donors, then the stakeholders that need to be at the table are very different. If the objective is to reduce the fragmentation and duplication and the mission creeps and the competitive behaviors, and I think our colleague just talked about, hinted at that, the pathway that you take is very different. And I think donors need to be a very important part of the conversation. It is great that there's leadership emerging from the South. I couldn't be happier but donors need to be part of this equation. And I think from that vantage point, the engagement of Europe is very important, because a very important player in these debates is not part of the equation. So Europe has to take leadership, and Europe has to take leadership to determine the future of the new global development architecture, of which the global health architecture is one element.
Thank you, Sania. Cardinal, I'm going to give you the last word, and I want to ask you to just give us your reflection briefly, if you would, on what this idea of win-win partnership really means, and what the principle is that should be running through this new global order. I know that's a big question, but you're a man of the church, and I think you can handle it.
So the win-win partnership, the issue about impact of the climate on health and all of those together, I think the impact of the climate on health, I think, occurs two ways, directly and indirectly. Directly when, for example, the environmental temperature rises to a point that everybody falls sick. It's almost like putting on a blanket in a temperature which the body cannot support. Indirectly, also, we do have a lot of consequences from the shortage of water, for example, and reducing, so having people, giving them access to water which is not healthy and all. So we can multiply all of these effects and defects in different places. But if it's to do the win-win type of thing, yes. I was in 2015 in Paris, at the first, COP 21 in Paris. And this issue came up. How do you position Europe and all the developing countries in helping deal with this situation? We had a few developing countries which dug in their heel and will not yield. And it's putting all the blame squarely at the door of Europe, because that's where the burning of coal began with the Industrial Revolution. If it was supposed to display, having begun in England in the 18th century and gradually spread to the continent, Europe to America, and so they were saying, you contributed most to this, so you pay most. Okay, you come up with the biggest whatever. And it took a certain amount of pleading with the groups that are dug in their heel to ease up on that, so that we could come to a conclusion, a consensus on the outcome of COP 21. So that happened, and we're still working on that. A lot of countries are still struggling with having to, take care of this compensationary deal, helping African countries deal with the mitigation and adaptation part of the climate consequence with the impact of this. But worst of it all is also the need to recognize that the developing countries have to be helped also to deal with their own production and contribution to the climate, the zero gases and all of that. For example, as Europe and the United States begin to change their car models to renewable energy battery type of thing, the thing to do is not to ship the old cars into Africa. You just transferring, the source of gas, polluting gas, from one part of the continent to the other. So if a policy exists that these are polluting, so it should not be done, then it should not be done here and should not be done there.
Yes, absolutely. And moving forward, though, what, in your view, should be the key principle guiding us?
I don't know how many of us here are familiar with the expression WUCA.
Anybody familiar with that expression? One.
Yeah, so we
a bit of education is
needed.
So we got
some, So it's looking at the situation in the world and say, a response for this is, our systems are very volatile. So volatility is the issue to deal with. Then there's a lot of uncertainty about issues. And the recognition a lot of features have become very, very complex. And so finally, the thing is also to recognize there is ambiguity in the system. From our side, this is okay, so that is all true. But can we also adapt models which make all of this positive and help us find solutions? So instead of volatility, we invite people to recognize the vulnerability of humanity, of all of us. The volatile situation is caused and contributed to by the vulnerability of all of us, fragility of our systems and everything. These are all what contributes to the volatility of the situation. So instead of volatility, let's think about our own vulnerabilities and how to leading our vulnerabilities, make us come together to formulate common solutions. Then with regard to the thing about uncertainty, that should invite us to unlearn our prejudices and biases towards, again, coming up with new models, innovations to help us deal with the situation. With complexity, why don't we think about compassion? And compassion enables us to also access not only an emotional sentiment within us, but also truth. Compassion engenders and generates truth. When it helps, it invites us to put ourselves in the situation of the one who is suffering and try to feel what he or she feels. And that accesses you to a truth that is valid for the candidate suffering, and that's also valid for you. So compassion is not just an emotional sentiment, but it's something that can also teach you the truth about a lot of situations and the truth about a lot of people in the situation they find themselves in. And when we've dealt with all of that, then quickly I think that we need to think about finding solutions to this. And then the solutions to this, we'd say, okay, so let us, we going also, or we need to stop?
And we finish with A. And what does A stand for?
A is ambiguity.
And it becomes?
Okay, and ambiguity becomes the development of answers.
That's
to
the one.
New complex situations.
That's the one.
That would enable us, make this transition or lead us into innovations.
And that's where we're going to end it, with
So-
answers. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you, Sania. Thank you, Cardinal. Thank you, Dr. Ngozi, Vice President, for a really thoughtful conversation. Thanks so much.
And thank you, Shirin, also for leading such a wonderful conversation. Coffee break. We'll be back here at 4 o'clock. I won't say any more. Thank you.